Hello, good afternoon. This would be your Zoom session on 120 Anatomy, Physiology, April 3rd, 2018. You'll notice my eyes quickly looking at the calendar here. And today we are covering unit, I believe, 6, I think. I'm going to look at that for sure. But I think it's regarding the 8th nerve. No, unit 7. Unit 7. Last week we finished Unit 6, Inner Ear Physiology. This week we launch into our last and final unit of this course. The 8th nerve and CANS, Central Auditory Nervous System. We will spend 2 to 3 weeks on this particular unit, probably 2. 1 week today, in other words, on the 8th nerve, and perhaps next week the central auditory nervous system. So let's look at the 8th nerve, which deals with retrocochlear pathology. I will share a screen and we'll find that PowerPoint and set of notes together. So, PowerPoint and notes here. Here would be the 8th nerve and central auditory nervous system, also abbreviated as CANS, C-A-N-S. Your readings are there. And the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Before we can talk about the 8th nerve, let's talk about nerves. Let's just get a better grip and a handle as to what are nerves. Now, we've covered ossicles, middle ear. We've covered hair cells, cochlea. But now let's look at nerve tissue and what are nerves? So, when you're thinking about the human nervous system, nerves carry information from the brain to the muscles and glands, and also back to the brain from the muscles and glands. Your glands of the body and muscles of the body communicate with the brain by way of nerves. So not all nerves are nerves. Nerves are different, okay? Not all highways are the same. Highways are different. So let's look at this. The central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. Basically, it controls your behavior. What comes out is different from what went in. So you had a message going in, and what you did about it is something else. So you've made a decision. And central nervous system, you either make a voluntary response or you make a reflex. And a reflex you have no control over. Acoustic reflex, for example. Or cross your legs and tap your knee with a hammer and your foot shoots out. Reflex. Or touch a hot pan and your hand instantly recoils. Reflex. Okay? PNS. PNS, peripheral nervous system, is all other nerves, everything else. So any part of your nervous system that's not your brain and not your spinal cord is your peripheral nervous system. So you've got all these pairs of cranial nerves inside your skull. Remember I said in 110 earlier today, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. I will stop sharing and look at you here. So you got 12 pairs of these nerves coming off of your brain stem. And we said your brain stem is about 1 inch long and it's about as thick as your pinky finger. Okay? It's the spinal cord inside your skull. And there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves that are attached to it. And the 8th pair is the auditory nerve. So I'll ask you, the 8th nerve, is it part of the central nervous system or it's part of the peripheral nervous system? Which one would it be? Based on our discussion that we just had. And the answer would be it's part of the peripheral nervous system. Even though it's inside your skull, it's not your brain and it's not your spinal cord. So if it's not your brain, brainstem, and spinal cord, it's the peripheral nervous system. Cranial nerves are just peripheral nerves that happen to be inside your head. Okay, but that doesn't mean they're part of the brain or central nervous system. So, I made that small. I have no idea why I did that. Okay, let's just share a screen again and have a look-see. So, spinal nerves, you have 31 pairs of these. Cranial nerves, you have 12 pairs of those. Those are spinal nerves that happen to be inside the skull or cranium. And then you have lots and lots and lots of smaller or tertiary nerves. So basically, here we go. Spinal cord then is actually part of your brain. It's like your brain has a long tail, goes all the way down your back. Many neural messages go along nerves to spinal cord and then right back out again. They never actually reach the cortex of your brain. These are called reflexes. Knee reflex, instant recoil from a hot stove, acoustic reflex. Those are messages that went from your hand, let's say, up your arm to your spinal cord, and your spinal cord gave an instant message saying, muscles retract, pull hand away from hot stove. That's a reflex. It didn't go all the way up to your mind and you never thought about it. I should probably remove my hand or my skin will scald. Okay? But some messages do go to the brain. So reflexes are part of behavior, but reflexes involve no voluntary control. And reflexes involve either your spinal cord or your brain stem, which is your spinal cord inside your skull. You can think of spinal cord and brain stem as your very primitive brain. Neural messages that actually go all the way to the brain, reactions involving conscious thought and awareness. For example, the first time tying a shoe, trying to find directions for the first time, thinking carefully about something. But after a while, you get used to things. You develop a pattern. I mean, when we're tying our shoes, we're not thinking about tying our shoes the same way a 6-year-old does. Make a bunny ear and then bend it and fold it and pull the bunny ears. You just kind of, you don't think about it anymore. Guess what? That task that used to involve the cortex has now been relegated to an older, more primitive part of the brain. The brain stem and upper, just lower parts of the brain. Okay, so patterns, awareness. When you're first looking for a house, someone's told you, go up this street, do this, go and do that, and you're looking at a map or you're checking this out and you're looking out the window. Well, if you've gone there several times, you're no longer doing that, are you? So you're no longer using your cerebral cortex as much. Now you're relegating that to an older and more primitive part of the brain, patterns. So it's a fascinating field, the nervous system, really. Anyway, good. Now let's talk about, we'll get into some pictures here. Okay, so we've covered the top of page 1. Let's look at some pictures. Here's a typical neuron fiber. A neuron fiber. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, let's go down here and take a look at the 8th nerve. When you're looking at the 8th nerve, excuse me, I've been talking way too much today. When you're looking at the 8th nerve as it leaves the cochlea, so here's your balance organs on the left, cochlea on the right, you can see the scala media is drawn here in gray, and you have the base of the cochlea and you have the apex of the cochlea. Now, look at how many fibers you've got. I'll pull them closer so you really see. Okay? You have thousands and thousands of fibers leaving the inner hair cells, joining up to the 8th nerve. You have 3,000 inner hair cells. 10 8th nerve fibers are in contact with each inner hair cell. So 3,000 times 10 equals 30,000. You have 30,000 8th nerve fibers, and they're all coiled together like a rope. And that's how you should think about nerves. Nerves are formed of thousands of fibers, neuron fibers, okay? So there's your cochlear nerve. You'll have a branch from the vestibular system as well, but we're mainly focusing on the cochlear branch of that. So now, when you break down neuron building blocks, Let's look at this, okay? So when you're looking at one particular neuron fiber, we'll go now back to the home. Here's a neuron fiber, one particular fiber. This one happens to be multipolar, what they call. Here's the cell body that feeds the neuron. Then you have lots of these little things sticking out here on the left. Those are called dendrites. And then you'll have a long arm sticking out called the axon. And the dendrites pick up information from the neuron that's next to it. And they send that information down the axon, and it ends in these little buttons. And at the end of those buttons, a little messages are shot out. These are synapses. So we'll look at that too, because at the end of the neuron fiber, the very end of the, so I'm going to go back over to here. These little buttons, okay, look at these guys here. They end them like a ball here, and they shoot out little neurotransmitters. Dopamine, other types of just these neurotransmitters are shot across what they call a synaptic cleft. See, they don't actually touch each other. So this neuron picked up information, and it's sending information to the next body of that needs to get that information, and it's sending it across a synaptic cleft. And you can see the transmitter opens up and poof, like spores, sends it on to the next one. Okay, interesting. It's so looking at a typical motor neuron. Motor neurons are connected to muscles. Okay, motor neurons are efferent. They send information from the brain to the body. Efferent, outward going, from brain out. Efferent, E-F-F-E-R-N-T, as opposed to afferent, A-F-F-E-R-E-N-T. Afferent means brain going. So what's brain going? Senses, vision, hearing, taste, touch, smell. Okay, sensory information is brain going. Motor information is the opposite direction, from the brain out. So multipolar neurons are efferent neurons that talk from the brain to the muscles. Same with, like, in the cochlea, the olivocochlear bundle, from the brain stem to the outer hair cells, to tell the outer hair cells to stretch and shrink. Those are the muscles. The outer hair cells are literally the muscles, in quotes, inside the cochlea. So they help the inner hair cells pick up soft sounds. So they would use multipolar neurons, the olivocochlear bundle, from the brain stem to the outer hair cells. Well, so typical neurons, you're looking at the pieces and parts. Okay, now look at the axon more closely. If you look at the axon more closely, you'll see these hot dog buns on it, these little white buns. And they're not all joined together. Now, these buns are white. They are fat. They're fatty. They are called lipids, L-I-P-I-D-S, lipids. Now, fatty tissue is like an insulation on an electrical wire. This fatty tissue is necessary for the neuron to be able to send messages. And the message jumps from this hillock here, and it jumps over to here, and jumps over to here, and jumps over to here. It's doo, 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 doo. These are the little nodes in the middle. So the message is you've got to have these layers of fatty tissue, and they are white. The rest of the neuron is gray. Gray matter? It's unmyelinated cell bodies. In other words, it's the neuron tissue that's not covered by the fat. And this fat is called myelin, M-Y-E-L-I-N, myelin. When you get multiple sclerosis, you are losing that white fatty layer. and you're losing the ability of your neurons to send messages. And so you've got multiple sclerosis. It's loss of that white, fatty myelin tissue. To categorize terms, really, when you're looking at the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system, I wish that, there you go, good. You'll see 4 boxes here. Categorization of terms: nerves, tracts, ganglia, and nuclei. All right, nerves, bundles of white axons in the PNS, bundles of these in the peripheral nervous system. So as an example, the 8th nerve, bundles of that white matter, okay? These are the axons of the nerve. Bundles of those they're white. Tracts, bundles of white axons. And what's an axon? The long arm, and it's layered in white. Bundles of those in the central nervous system. So in the brain, okay, or in the spinal cord, tracts. Now, if we think about an example there, let's do it. Tracts. Maybe I've got a good picture to show you here. Tracts. Yeah, here you go. Here's the brain split in half. Okay, gray matter on the outside, unmyelinated. Look at the white matter on the inside. When you think of the white matter in the central nervous system, these are tracts. And it's the fatty white tissue. It's almost like if you take a cauliflower or broccoli and you slice it down the middle, and you can see the florets on the outside, and you see these big white arms, or the trunk, the stalks. Okay, that would be the white matter tracts. So tracts are simply white bundles of white matter axons in the central nervous system, as opposed to in the peripheral nervous system. And then you've got 2 more boxes, ganglia and nuclei. These ganglia are bundles of gray, unmyelinated. They're not fat, they're not covered, it's the cell bodies, okay? This stuff here that's not covered with the white hot dog buns. And an example is in cochlear anatomy, the spiral ganglia. What's a spiral ganglia? Bundles of 8th nerve cell bodies just inside the modiolus of the cochlea. And those bundles are not white, they're unmyelinated. It's the axon going to the brain that's myelinated, and that's white. So when you get a bundle of unmyelinated cell bodies, not white, they're gray, okay? In the PNS, it's called ganglia. And when you've got bundles of gray matter like that in the central nervous system, they're called nuclei. So remember this morning in 110, I was talking about the superior olivary complex, and I was showing you with my fingers all the time. I was saying the 2 little pairs of nuclei in your brain stem going down from your brain, you got pairs of these nuclei. Okay, one of the pairs is called the superior olivary complex. Well, those are gray matter, they're not myelinated, and they're all cell bodies, okay, so they're nuclei. And then another pair of gray nuclei, another pair of gray nuclei going doop, 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 up the brainstem. Whereas when you've got a bundle of that in the peripheral nervous system, they're called ganglia. So never think that a nerve is all by itself. It's always bundled. You've got a bundle of neuron, a bundle of cell bodies. And in the peripheral nervous system and in the central nervous system, they have different names, okay? So you've now got 4 different categories of names. White matter is the top 2 boxes, nerves and tracts. Bundles of white axons in the PNS, bundles of white matter in the CNS. And then you have the same neurons, but now you're not looking at their axons in white anymore. Now you're looking at their cell bodies, ganglia and nuclei. Count on it. It's good, quizzable material. Good stuff. Now, for an impulse to continue from one neuron to another, it must cross the synaptic cleft at what's called a synapse. So this is one neuron talking to the next neuron. And notice they don't quite touch. Okay, the direction, here's the cell body, gray. These are the dendrites. There's the white axon, covered with those hot dog buns, a direction of nerve impulse, sending it to the end, and then you've got that poof of the balloons here at the very end, poof, and you're shooting out the neurotransmitter to the next neuron. Okay? They have to cross what's called a synaptic cleft at a synapse. And a synapse is just where one neuron's talking to the next one, but they're not touching. There's a synaptic cleft separating them, and it's neurotransmitters that have to cross from the end of the synaptic buttons of one neuron to the dendrites of the other one. All right, now you're looking at two different kinds of neurons. One's the multipolar that we've discussed earlier. So if I took you home here, that's the multipolar. That's the one on the left. Okay? Multipolar, axon, and then a lot of ending buttons here. Okay, gray area, white areas. And now look at a hair cell. Here's an inner hair cell. You can tell because of its shape. Outer hair cells are long test tube shaped. Inner hair cells are shaped like pears. Okay, and here's the eighth nerve. Now the eighth nerve is unique because it's not multipolar. It's called bipolar. Basically, it has a cell body in the middle and one axon here and another axon there. Weird, huh? And the eighth nerve is unique. The bundles of these cell bodies would be called the spiral ganglia. All right, the spiral ganglia. And why don't I, just for the heck of it, why don't I try and highlight that for you so you can see it better? So if we go into inner ear anatomy, and I'll see if I can show you, well, we can refresh our memories a little bit about the spiral ganglia, just so we have a better idea of it. So here's what I'll do. I'll go into this area here, and we'll go into, okay, here you go. Spiral ganglia. Okay, look at the cell bodies on the left here. This would be one axon of the eighth nerve ending at the inner hair cells, and the other axon would follow my cursor, go to the brain. Here's another picture showing you one, see all the neuron fibers going to the hair cells, mainly to the inner hair cells. Okay, these fibers here are the olivocochlear bundle coming from the outer hair cells, or being sent to the outer hair cells from the brain. So these neuron fibers would be efferent, and the eighth nerve fibers are afferent. So here's one, the bundle of axons, and here's all the eyes. You have a feeling you're being watched. Okay, look at all these cell bodies, spiral ganglia. Very important to see it. Now here's another way of looking at it, okay? In a picture that I drew, it's just a cross section of the cochlea, and the little round gray circles here would be the spiral ganglia. Now please don't think you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spiral ganglia. Actually, as you know, they're going all the way up the coils of the brain. So you got hundreds of them, you know, like okay, this is just a cross section, and that's why you see some 6 or so, okay? Just kind of playing around here. Here's another picture of spiral ganglia. I'll bring it closer so you can see it better. One here, 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 okay? They're just bundles of cell bodies, gray, so they're unmyelinated, and then this main axon, or all these fibers, leave the inner hair cells and they're going to the brain. Good. Okay. Now back to where we were. So sensory neurons are bipolar. Motor neurons are multipolar. Sensory neurons are afferent. Motor neurons are efferent. They have different shapes. Here again, motor neuron on the top, efferent, multipolar, bipolar, the middle one, afferent, sensory neuron for smell, vision, and hearing. And then you've got these weird ones, unipolar, afferent, sensory neurons for touch, etc. But basically one cell body and then two axons heading out. So, now where are we in our notes? Okay, here we go. Myelin, white fatty sheath that lines the neuron fiber, allows electrical transmission along the axons. Gray matter is unmyelinated neuron cell bodies. Bundles of white myelinated fibers in the peripheral nervous system are called nerves. In the central nervous system, these are called tracts. For example, the term eighth nerve is a bundle of myelinated neuron fibers in the peripheral nervous system. When you think of cortical-spinal tract, we'll follow the names, cortico-spinal. So it's one of those long white stalks of cauliflower that I talked about earlier when you slice it in half and you see those big the arms going down. So corticospinal tracts are going to be white matter bundles in the central nervous system. And they're white as well. They're myelinated. Groups of unmyelinated neuron cell bodies in the PNS are called ganglia, and the CNS are called nuclei. So the superior olivary complexes are called nuclei. The spiral ganglia is ganglia. That's eighth nerve cell bodies, and the olivocochlear bundle is a bunch of cell bodies inside the brain stem. Good. Next. Okay, ganglia, nucleus. Okay, you're going to see that term called cochlear nucleus. We'll talk about that more next week, not so much this week. But the term spiral ganglia is an example of unmyelinated neuron cell bodies in the PNS. You could write here superior olivary complex is an example of unmyelinated cell bodies in the CNS. We haven't covered cochlear nucleus, but you could just substitute here superior olivary complex is an example of a group of unmyelinated cell bodies in the CNS. The eighth nerve, we said, is bipolar. It's a sensory nerve. It's afferent. It goes to the brain. Relatively few in number. Found only in mammals. Motor neurons are multipolar. They are efferent because they return from the central nervous system back to muscles or glands. There are more of them. And then you have tiny little interneurons, include everything between the above. Trillions of these in the brain. They tend to integrate sensory experience and organize muscular behavior. So interneurons. Take a breather here. I'm looking outside through my window. Okay, you just get to look at a little box in the corner and see some notes here. I could pick up the computer and turn the screen, but I don't know. Should I do that? Who knows? I don't know. Anatomy, physiology of the eighth nerve. I wonder if I can do that. I wonder how hard that is to do. I wonder if I'll screw anything up if I do it. Here's hoping I don't. It would be a real drag if I did, but there you go. I guess that would be outside Ted's house. Anyway, there you go. Back over to here. Why don't I plug in my things? I'm just taking a break here. There we go. Plug in my printer, plug in my scanner again. Good stuff. Okay, anatomy and physiology of the eighth nerve itself. So let's look at the anatomy and physiology of the eighth nerve now. We've basically talked about neurons, and now we've got the lingo and language of the nervous system. Now let's look at the eighth nerve. From the spiral ganglia through the internal auditory meatus to the brain stem. So what's the pathway of the eighth nerve? It leaves the cochlea and it goes through what's called the internal auditory meatus. The external auditory meatus is your ear canal. The internal auditory meatus is a tiny little tunnel through hard bone to get to your brainstem. The eighth nerve is only 1 inch long. It's the shortest of all cranial nerves, 1 inch long. Your brain stem is 1 inch long. Your eighth nerve is an inch long. Okay? So it meets the brain stem at the cochlear nucleus, located at what is called the pontomedullary junction. So now let's look at the base of the brain, which is what we're doing here. We're looking from the bottom up. So you can see the brain stem. This is the spinal cord inside the skull. You'll see this white area here. That's called your cerebellum. That's a part of your brain that controls fine motor movement. If you had damage to the cerebellum, you'd be walking like a drunk. You would have difficulty doing up the buttons of your shirt. You'd have real difficulty sewing. Okay, so fine motor control is the cerebellum. So you have the brain stem, cerebellum, and then you have the cerebrum, the big area that with the wrinkles on it, the cortex. We're looking from the bottom up. These would be up the top here. These are the olfactory bulbs. Interesting. We don't understand smell very well. We really don't. But this is saying you've got 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And look at them all along where my cursor is here. Okay, so they go from various areas and they touch the brain stem. And the eighth pair, follow my cursor, right there. They meet the brain stem at what's called the pontomedullary junction. The pons is this, and the medulla is the bottom. Okay, the medulla is the bottom of the brainstem. The pons is the middle of the brainstem. Here is the spinal cord as it leaves the skull. And when it leaves the skull, you've got 31 pairs of nerves off of there. Okay, so you got 12 cranial nerves. You have 12 pairs, and you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves after you've descended out of the skull. Eighth nerve fibers are coiled like a rope, and the eighth nerve is tonotopic. In other words, specific frequencies are represented in specific places. Lows are on the inside, as you can see. Highs are wrapped around on the outside. So here's a picture of the balance system, vestibular system, semicircular canals, utricle and saccule. And here's the cochlea, and you can see the vestibular branches of the eighth nerve, and you can see the auditory branch of the eighth nerve. Here's a real picture of the spiral ganglion. So I guess to your right would be the hair cells inside the cochlea, and now you're looking at the hundreds and thousands of cell bodies, unmyelinated gray areas, spiral ganglia, nerve cell bodies of the cochlear nerve, eighth nerve. Now the eighth nerve is tonotopic, and that is shown by what's called tuning curves. Tuning curves are really weird, okay? Frequency, I'll pull this up so you can see it better. You're going to see 6 tuning curves here. And all we did was we picked 6 of these fibers. You have 30,000. We just picked 6. And we said, hey, man, if this is frequency from 1 hertz, to 1,000 hertz, to 10,000 hertz, that's how you should look at it. It's kind of logarithmic. So all the way from lows to highs, okay? And the vertical axis represents the decibels needed to make a specific neuron fiber fire. So we've got 30,000 of these. We picked 6. And so we plotted them here. We said, okay, let's look at this guy right here. Let's find out if it's tuned to a specific frequency. What's going to make that neuron fiber fire? What's going to make it send a message? And we find out that these are decibels up along the vertical. And at one particular frequency, the tip right there, very few decibels was required to get that neuron fiber to fire. But if we moved away from that particular point, we needed way more decibels to get that neuron fiber to fire. And if we moved further away, you needed more. And if we moved higher in frequency, we really needed more. These are called tuning curves. It means that each fiber is tuned to a specific frequency. Tuning curves show that the eighth nerve is tonotopic, that specific frequencies are represented in specific places. So probably this tuning curve over here is probably from the outside of the eighth nerve, probably from around here. Whereas when you look at this tuning curve here, at the top left, it's probably more from fibers deeper inside. Okay, so tuning curves just show that the eighth nerve fibers are specifically tuned to specific frequencies. And that makes sense because they're attached to different hair cells along the way. These eighth nerve fibers are communicating with these inner hair cells. These eighth nerve fibers here are communicating with these inner hair cells here. So it makes sense. Now, when you've got sensory neural hearing loss, remember we talked about the traveling wave and outer hair cells sharpening the peak? And when you've got outer hair cell damage, your traveling wave is now rounded. Well, guess what? The point of a tuning curve is called the characteristic frequency. Okay, that shows the particular frequency that fiber is, to which that fiber is tuned. All right, that's the characteristic frequency, CF. Now, if we look what happens with sensory neural hearing loss, okay, the tuning curve is no longer sharp and pointed anymore. Now the tuning curve is dull and rounded. In other words, that particular fiber, let's take this one here, is no longer specifically tuned to one particular frequency anymore. It's more dull and rounded. So you can see how the dull and rounded traveling wave that takes place due to outer hair cell damage, that picture is sent further up the system, and it's also reflected in eighth nerve tuning curves. And they too now are more dull and rounded, meaning that this particular fiber here is now no longer tuned only to this particular frequency, it's tuned to a bunch of them. So now more energy, more decibels is required to get that neuron fiber to fire because you've got hair cell damage, outer hair cell damage, and to be specific, you've lost your specificity. More frequencies can get that fiber to fire, not just the one that's particularly there. Okay, so the dull and rounded traveling wave that occurs with damage to outer hair cells is reflected further with dull and rounded tuning curves. So here is an eighth nerve tumor. Here's the internal auditory meatus. This is the tunnel through which the eighth nerve travels to get to the brain stem. It's not very long, but this is all bone. Okay, and here's your tumor. And the tumor hasn't got any place to grow. But if the tumor can get into the brain stem, if it can leave the internal auditory meatus, and it can expand over here, now look at how big the tumor is. Now it can grow because brain tissue is soft. And many times when that tumor grows in the because it's escaped out of that internal auditory meatus, and now it's pushing the whole brain stem aside. And note, it also affects the seventh cranial nerve. Now, the seventh cranial nerve is attached to the tensor tympani muscle of the acoustic reflex, but it's also the nerve that makes you be able to smile. It's a cheek muscle. So many people who have an eighth nerve tumor have problems or tingling on the cheek as well, because guess what also goes through the internal auditory meatus? The seventh cranial nerve, which has nothing to do with hearing. It's a facial nerve. Okay, but all these neurons are close together. If you look, I mean, they're not far apart. If you're looking at these guys here. Okay, look at them all. They're all bunched together. So if you've got a tumor on the 8th nerve, it's probably going to put pressure on the 7th nerve as well. Here's the 8th, and that's the 7th. Okay, so, and these two neurons go through the internal auditory meatus. So they're going to cause trouble together. Now, 8th nerve tumors are called retrocochlear pathology. Retro means behind. One of the jobs of an HIS is to recognize what's called red flags. Now, a unilateral sensory neural hearing loss in one ear is a red flag. Because when you get old presbycusis, one ear doesn't get old faster than the other, both ears age. So the hair cell damage will be similar to both ears. So hair cell loss, sensory neural hearing loss due to aging usually is bilaterally symmetrical, the same. When you've got asymmetrical sensory neural loss, then you have to look further. Does the person have Meniere's disease in one ear? Is the person a trucker? So does he have more noise exposure to one ear? Okay, but if you've ruled all that out and there's a difference in sensory neural loss between the ears, that's what's called a red flag, and you need to refer to an audiologist or to a doctor. Why? Because it could be retrocochlear pathology, which means it's a tumor. It could be a tumor of the 8th nerve. Now, 8th nerve tumors are benign. They're not cancerous, but they will kill you. Okay, because there's no place for them to grow, and eventually they will cause their own complications by pushing onto the brain stem and causing really bad problems like this. So 8th nerve tumors are something to be reckoned with. Now here's a picture of the a cross section of the internal auditory meatus. So here it is. Okay, you got your 7th facial nerve. You have your vestibular portions of the 8th nerve. You have your auditory portions of the 8th nerve. And notice how when you go in further, the frequency represented is lower. Further out to the outside, the frequency represented is higher. So all these tuning curves would show higher frequencies. Tuning curves from fibers deep in, okay, would be more from the apical hair cells. So they would show more low frequency. The characteristic frequencies would be more over low frequencies. So the 8th nerve is tonotopic. Now here's a schematic showing you the same thing as this, okay? Only here, they're showing you a tumor. So you have your vestibular portions of the 8th nerve, your auditory portion of the 8th nerve, your 7th facial nerve, and here's the tumor. And the tumor can push on all of these. And remember, all around here is bone. So there's no give at all. Now, ABR is kind of interesting. This is called the auditory brainstem response. ABR. Auditory brainstem response. It's not a test done by the HIS. It's done by audiologists. And what they do is they put electrodes on your earlobes. They put an electrode right here between your eyes, and they'll put a 4th electrode right on the hairline, right here. And then they'll put headphones on the ears, and out of the headphones will come these weird sounds like clicks. And each creates brainwaves. And the ABR, auditory brainstem response equipment, adds them all up, adds them all up, and then divides by the number of presentations of those, and you get what's called your auditory brainstem response. And your auditory brainstem response has 5 bumps. Look at the right and the left ear. It's called ABR. Bump number 1 is from the 8th nerve as it's leaving the inner hair cells. Bump number 2, where my cursor is where the 8th nerve meets the brainstem. And bumps 3, 4, and 5 come from the nuclei inside the brainstem. That's why they call it auditory brainstem response. It really assesses the 8th nerve for the first 2 peaks and the brain stem for the last 3 peaks. Now, it's got 2 purposes that they use it for 2 different reasons. One is to estimate thresholds in babies. Okay, so look, at 80 dB, at 60, at 40, at 20, notice the ABR tends to deteriorate, but that last 5th peak remains visible. And if that remains visible all the way down to 20, it means the baby likely has pretty good hearing. We don't know exactly at what frequencies, but we know there's hearing quite a bit, especially at the highs. And when you're looking at the left ear, same thing. Down, 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 and we still see a piece of an ABR taking place. So that's what's done at clinics that audiologists use to assess hearing in babies, okay? Now, again, if we were looking at the second purpose, the second purpose is to detect 8th nerve tumors. You got a right ear here and a left ear here. And look what it says here. Results of auditory brainstem response testing on a patient with an 8th nerve hearing loss, acoustic tumor in the left ear. So look what's happening here. The right ear, 80, there's all your peaks, 60, 30, okay, all normal. But look at the left ear. Look at what's different here. The ABR got longer. And there's a delay between 1 and 3. That's where the delay is. This interval from 1 to 3 is bigger than this interval from 1 to 3. And yet the interval from 3 to 5 is unchanged. That's the same time interval to here. So we can say, you know what, you have an 8th nerve tumor because your ABR is abnormal in the first part. Peaks 1 and 2 are screwed up. Okay, that's where your problem is. So we think that your tumor is probably on the 8th nerve and not the brain stem. If it was the brain stem, then this interval between 1 and 3 would be normal. It would look like this, but the delay, there would be an elongation between peaks 3 and 5. And then we'd go, oh, you have a brain stem tumor. See? Retrocochlear pathology. So the ABR has 2 purposes: to estimate thresholds in little beings that can't tell you what they hear, and to look for 8th nerve tumors. So here's a story, and I'm just going to have you read this story to yourselves. It's a real tale of a woman who's had an 8th nerve tumor, and it's quite something. We want to make sure that you highlight this or that you read that. I'm going to go to your notes and make sure we've covered what we need to do. 8th nerve is tonotopic. Yep, you know that. Fibers, high-frequency fibers are on the outside. Low-frequency fibers are on the inside. Carry on. Move on down. Okay. We look at the top of the page here. It's axons. Interesting. The 8th nerve, I never really told you this, but if you think about my head being the cell body and that my arms being the axons, the arm going to the brain is myelinated. But the arm going from the cell bodies, the spiral ganglion, to the inner hair cells is not myelinated. Interesting. It's just an aside. You don't need to know that, but I just thought I'd tell you. It's in your notes. Okay, its axons are unmyelinated within the cochlea, become myelinated after the spiral ganglia going to the brain. You got 30,000 of them, basically about 10 fibers per hair cell. Oh, malware. Okay, cell bodies are located in the spiral ganglia. Olivocochlear bundle, put a star by that as well. It's a separate bundle of only 1,800 fibers going from 12,000 outer hair cells. Because you have 12,000 outer hair cells and 3,000 inner hair cells in each cochlea. So the inner hair cells are spoiled rotten. They each get 10 8th nerve fibers. Outer hair cells mostly talk, there's 12,000 of them, but they only communicate with 1,800 efferent fibers, the olivocochlear bundle. It runs alongside of the 8th nerve, and the cell bodies of that olivocochlear bundle are located in the superior olivary complexes, those 2 little nuclei inside the brain stem. don't know why that box keeps popping up. Anyway, so anyway, when we were looking at your notes here, now you've got eighth nerve tuning curves. We've covered that. Okay, and you can have a read of that. We'll do a little bit of review on that next week. And pathology of the eighth nerve. Whoa, don't want to zoom in. Pathology of the eighth nerve. Total deafness without an eighth nerve. If you section or cut the eighth nerve, you're going to have total deafness, obviously. The internal auditory meatus diameter is tiny. Therefore, tiny tumors can drastically affect eighth nerve function. The tumor at the pontomedullary junction, where the eighth nerve meets the brainstem, can be a lot larger before it causes problems. And that's as we saw here. Okay, this is much larger. The pontomedullary junction, the medulla, the pons. Okay, medulla, pons. The eighth nerve meets the brainstem at the pontomedullary junction. All right. Term retrocochlear means pathology beyond the cochlea. Eighth nerve pathology is almost always unilateral. That's why asymmetrical sensory neural loss is a red flag. Resultant sensory neural loss can vary widely in degree across frequencies. Doesn't have to be a profound loss, might be a moderate loss, might be only a slight loss, depends on how big the tumor is. Usually very poor speech recognition in the affected ear. Remember I talked this morning in 110 about monosyllabic, single-syllable words. I was talking about performance index functions and all that. And I said one test we do in speech audiometry is called speech discrimination, where we talk at a normal loudness level to the person. He or she can easily hear you. And we cover our faces and we have them say single-syllable words. Say the word head. Say the word eye. Say the word door, that kind of, you're testing the clarity of their hearing. And when you've got an eighth nerve tumor, often the clarity of your hearing is gone. You really lose speech discrimination ability. Put a star by this section here. Tinnitus, ringing in the ear, is sometimes a problem. The auditory brainstem response, it's an electrophysiological brainwave test done to differentially diagnose cochlear from retrocochlear. Now we get into the central auditory nervous system, but that's next week. So look at what we all have covered today. Okay, again, here's the part that we brushed over pretty quickly, and I don't really want you to know a lot here. Just you need to know that eighth nerve tuning curves show you that the eighth nerve is tonotopic. In other words, the tuning curves show that each particular neuron fiber in the eighth nerve is tuned to a specific frequency. Okay, that's mainly what I need you to know. And you should know what characteristic frequency, it's the downward point. It shows the frequency where the least decibel level is required to get that fiber to fire. It means that eighth nerve fiber is tuned to that particular frequency. Okay, basically. And again here, note the similarity between shapes of active traveling wave envelopes and the sharp shape of an eighth nerve tuning curve. Note opposite but complementary shapes. Both of them asymmetrical too, FYI. Okay, so now let's end this session just by looking and reading this little thing here. Let's blow this up and make it a little larger. Acoustic neuroma caught our family completely by surprise despite the slow progression. In 1992, my wife Linda began to experience balance problems and loss of hearing. The doctor thought it might be an inner ear problem, suggested she reduce salt and caffeine, referred her to a specialist for an ABR. They call it a brainstem auditory evoked. Same thing. The test came back inconclusive. Within a few weeks, the symptoms subsided. We figured the salt and coffee must have been the cause. Anyway, a couple of years later, she began to notice a loss of sensation in her teeth, gums, and tongue. They referred her to a dentist, who then referred her to an oral surgeon. She was finally referred to an ear, nose, and throat doctor who sent her for a CAT scan. It revealed a 3-centimeter tumor growing from her auditory canal inward along the auditory nerve. We were stunned by the diagnosis. Our daughters and I were looking for a simple explanation. Instead, we learned that the 8th nerve tumor is a serious condition requiring major surgery. So basically, it's a benign tumor that grows around the nerve sheath from the inner ear through an opening in the skull, the internal auditory meatus, through to the brain. The tumor grows slowly, putting pressure on the nerves in the opening and eventually on the brain stem itself. As the nerve sheath is compressed, it causes hearing loss, loss of facial sensation, tinnitus, and other symptoms. If untreated, it can kill you. Statistically, and put a star by this, 1 in 100,000 people get it. So in the city of Springfield, Missouri, maybe 1.5 people have it, because I believe there's about 150,000 in Springfield, maybe 200, I don't know. Treatment includes surgery, and they usually deafen the ear in the surgery. They have to go right through the cochlea. They call it a translabyrinthine technique. Results in total loss of hearing for the affected ear. The operation lasted 9 hours. They ran into complication, and look where my cursor is, partial facial paralysis. And so she's going through years of physiotherapy to get her facial nerve to work better again. Really quite something. The bottom says Linda's facial paralysis proved to be one of the biggest obstacles she'd struggled to overcome, physically and emotionally. The loss of self-confidence in her appearance has caused her to withdraw from situations. She fights an ongoing battle of pain. 10 years after the operation, she continues to counter the effects of the surgery. So it isn't for sissies, okay? Anyway, I'll sign off here. We're done now. Next week, we'll look at the central auditory nervous system. Anyway, it's been a slice. I'll stop sharing here. I'll stop recording and bid you adieu. Live long and prosper.